Okay, everyone, let's just take a little bit of time, and what I'd like you to do is jot down everything that comes to your mind when you hear the word history. I'm going to tell you when to start and when to stop, and you can start right now. Okay, you have about 5 seconds left. Finish up that last idea or word and put down your pen or pencil. More than likely, one of the first things that came to your mind was dates, or maybe it was important people and events. Typically timelines or something that first pops into our head when we hear the word history, or great dead white old guys that we need to learn about, and important dates. But what I'd like us to start doing as we get ready to think about teaching history is that history is really centered around two important concepts: perspective and interpretation. And so I'm going to spend a couple minutes just talking about each one of these, giving some examples, and then I'm going to ask you in your small groups to generate a couple of examples from current events that reflect one or both of these concepts, historical concepts. Okay, so the first one, perspective. I'm sure it's something that you're pretty familiar with, and I think this cartoon here does a good job of helping us understand why perspective is important whenever we're telling any story. So the story of this cartoon, depending on which fish you are, is very different in terms of how much justice you perceive there to be in the world. Here's another image, if you will, that helps us think about perspective. It really flips sort of everything on its head by suggesting that Native Americans were really the first Homeland Security team, and that they were really the first group of people fighting terrorists, taking terms and applying them in different contexts to give us a different perspective. And then finally, here's this shirt that suggests that if you don't interpret this particular symbol in a particular way, you really don't understand anything about the past. And more than likely, you would find a shirt of exactly the opposite that might state, if the shirt does not offend you, then you need a history lesson. So perspective is very important when we're talking about history or anybody's story. So one big question that historians will grapple with is, whose history is it important to tell? Whose history are they interested in learning more about? Whose story do we share? Second thing that drives history, or the practice of doing history, is the art of interpretation. So interpretation typically happens after, right, we've constructed a narrative of an event. So if you think about perspective helping us be able to construct a narrative of events, bringing all different perspectives together to tell a story or a history, interpretation is what we do when we try to make sense of that narrative or that flow of events. So here, for example, is an alternative interpretation of the end of Reconstruction and the compromises made in order to bring the southern states back into the Union. And you get a real sense here in this cartoon that this person's interpreting these compromises as a sellout, that what they really did was undermine everything that they thought the Civil War stood for. So I'm going to walk through one specific example about John Brown, and then I'm going to ask you to do some work in your small group. So many folks, that John Brown's story gets interpreted in that he was just a crazy old man who was violent and, wanted to wreak a lot of havoc across the country, and he needed to be, stopped, put down. And you can tell by this image here with the fire burning in the background and John Brown with the gun and his crazy face, that John Brown, crazy guy. Then we have another interpretation of John Brown's actions. Here he gets depicted sort of as a freedom fighter, a hero. He's carrying the young African-American girl in his arms. He's got the U.S. flag, and it's sort of like he's a savior. He's coming to save, and there's some, like a tornado in the background, but he's not really depicted as super violent. And finally, another interpretation of John Brown's actions. Here, John Brown seems passionate. Is he crazy? Is he trying to bring people together? In other words, this interpretation sort of recognizes both parts of John Brown, a freedom fighter and someone that maybe took things to extremes. So this is the two concepts I want you to think about. And the question for historians then is not only what story or whose history needs to be told, but what does that history mean? What does it, now that we've told a story, what does it mean? What's the message we need it's being sent? Issues that are at the heart of history and doing history deal with controversy and conflict, and in particular wrestling with different ways to understand bias and how we can use history to help us understand what's going on today. So what I'd like you to do in your small groups for the next 5 minutes or so, until I call you back together, is to try to come up with a list of current events that are linked to one of the two key concepts in history, whether that's perception or interpretation.